Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be sharing my #1 draft strategy for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, like I'm sure many of you have over the last couple years, you've been refining your overall strategies as you approach your leagues. Now, you're not alone in this regard because I have as well. You know, in the last 5 years, we've seen so much change in the National Football League, and we've seen so much change in fantasy football that every year you have to continue to adapt to the meta, and you have to continue to refine your strategies in order to find the most success in that given year. So I wanted to go ahead, take some time out of my day to share with you guys my #1 draft strategy going into the 2022 fantasy football season. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of helping you win a fantasy football championship. Later this afternoon, I will be live streaming here on the channel, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Hopefully this video comes out before then. So if you're checking this out, be sure to drop by later this afternoon. We'll be drafting, answering questions, and doing all that. Thank you very much. Also, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, go ahead and be sure to do so today. Again, there's a link down in the description of the video. When you use promo code Andrew, you can get access to my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format. All you have to do is use promo code Andrew when you make a first-time deposit. Not only will you get my fantasy football draft rankings, but you'll also get a first-time deposit match up to $100, which you'll be able to use to join a multitude of best ball leagues. I know the Pomeranian is going on right now. You can go ahead and draft, gain experience this offseason before your leagues are drafting. All right, thank you very much. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about my favorite draft strategy going into the 2022 fantasy football season. And I understand you can go ahead and use whatever strategy you'd like and find success, but I'm explaining to you guys where I have found the most success in seasons past and why I've continued to go in this direction. So first and foremost, I always want to try to draft 2 running backs within my first 3 rounds. Now, this especially applies for half PPR scoring formats, and I'll tell you exactly why. The information that sits currently to the right of me, all these numbers, I'll go ahead and kind of explain to you what they exactly define and represent. Now, at the very top, I call this my drop-off in production. I've gone ahead and taken the averages of the top 32 running back, wide receivers, and tight ends over the course of the last 5 seasons, 2017 through 2021. By finding the averages, I've gone ahead and kind of given us an idea as to where the running back, wide receiver, and tight end drop-off in production begins to show itself. Now, let me explain to you exactly what that means. As you can see on screen to the right of me, we have the running back position that, typically in a half PPR is the dominant force. Their first top 5 players are typically always putting up great numbers, and that's what we've seen over the course of the last 5 seasons. But as soon as you get to like the top 16, and then you break off to the second half, you get to 17, 18, 19 at the running back position, we begin to see a more defined separation of value between the running back position and the respective wide receivers that would be available at that given moment in time. Now, like I'm sure we're all aware of, as a draft progresses from round to round, the value at the running back position begins to diminish. And that's why we typically want to go ahead and draft early running backs. But besides the fact that we're trying to grab high valued players, but we're also trying to avoid the lower valued running backs that are often known as the dead zone players that don't really return much value. Now, let me explain to you why this exists. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, like I mentioned, we've seen a lot of, changes in the fantasy football landscape. Like when we go back to 2019, there were 15 running backs that ran for over 1,000 rushing yards. Just last season, we only saw 7 running backs accomplish that. In 2020, we only saw 8 running backs accomplish that. We're getting a huge dip in terms of overall running back productivity, mainly because we're seeing more running back by committee situations, and we're seeing far more diversity in backfields. For example, an Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon backfield that they're sharing. So if the National Football League continues to go in that direction, the running backs that are typically coming off the boards within the first 3 rounds are the guys that we want to have on roster, so we don't have to worry about any of the players from rounds 4 through 7 who typically are questionable players. Now, like I mentioned just a moment ago, I refer to the running back dead zone. That is the span of time between rounds 4 through 7 that we have seen over the last couple of years be extremely volatile at the running back position. In fact, when we look at the rounds 4 through 7 in terms of ADPs of last season's running back, nearly 65% of those running backs did not return value based on where they were selected last season. And this isn't just the case for last year. We've seen that year over year for the last couple seasons. And that's why the running back dead zone has been given its name. I didn't name it that. That has already been the case for the last couple years and will continue to be. Now, when we look at the running back position from rounds 4 through 7 in a normal half PPR scoring format, we're talking about players that could very easily be Akers, Dobbins, Breece Hall, Damian Harris, Elijah Mitchell, Ramondre Stevenson, A.J. Dillon, Chase Edmonds, Rashad Penny, players that we're not 100% sure, are going to find immediate success. Some of these players, have other running backs in their backfield. Some of them are, coming back from significant injuries. There are other players that may always get injured and maybe on a path to once again finding themselves on the injured reserve in this upcoming season. There's a lot of questions within that span of time. So what I'm suggesting is you take 2 running backs within your first 3 rounds. Now, I don't care in which order you do it. If you want to start wide receiver, by all means, take advantage of that. But the whole point is we are trying to grab running backs that are at the top of the list in terms of opportunity, whether that's rushing attempts or targets, and what kind of opportunities. We want running backs that are going to have goal line attempts. We want the guys that are going to be in the top 5 of that category so that they have touchdowns accompanying their performances, which will ultimately determine their overall success in that given season. Now, like you can see on screen, as we get past the top 16 running backs, which we typically see come off the board in our drafts within the first 3 rounds, the wide receiver position begins to take a massive lead in terms of a fantasy point average in a given season, and just only continues to separate itself from the available running backs going forward. Now, of course, this is all under the assumption that we're drafting the players that end up in this position. If we didn't think a running back was going to be the number 10 in that given year, we wouldn't take him in that position. But at this current moment in time, the value at wide receiver from rounds 3 through 7 truly do present a lot of upside. And though there are some players in that range that are just consistent and they're not going to have, incredible upside in a given year, I still want to talk about the values that are, available to you, so that if you do select 2 running backs within your first 2 rounds, specifically in your first and second, that 3rd round wide receiver value and going forward it's pure gold. So let's talk about some of the wide receivers in that range. Specifically, let's talk about Keenan Allen because he's proven consistency. And I just want to specifically compare him to the running back position over the last 5 years. I mean, again, like we've mentioned in the past, Keenan Allen has been a top 14 wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format for 5 consecutive years. I mean, the guy has just been one of the best players in the National Football League. We all know that. But specifically, in a half PPR scoring format over the last 5 years, he's averaged 205.25 fantasy points. Now, if you go ahead and made Keenan Allen a running back, he would have finished in 2017 as RB9, in 2018 RB12, in 2019 RB14, in 2020 RB9, and in 2021 he would have been RB11. Overall, we're talking about a wide receiver that has, somehow, some way relegated himself to the back end of the 3rd round in terms of ADP. I don't know why that is even the case. This man should be drafted way before that, but I'm not going to argue with it. Whatever it is, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of said ADPs. But nonetheless, we're talking about a player who is at an identical value as some of the top tier running backs that are being selected within the first 2 rounds, and yet you're able to get him at the back end of the 3rd. Now, this conversation is going to continue this season in the 3rd round. Michael Pittman Jr., A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, T. Higgins, Mike Williams. There's so much value to be had in that 3rd round. And all of those players, in my opinion, have more upside than Keenan Allen. So not only are they going to have that 200-point, basic floor of production this upcoming season, but they'll have the upside of getting to that 225-point range and maybe shocking us all and going beyond that. But let's go ahead and let's talk about Brandin Cooks, another one of these consistent wide receivers over the last couple of years. He's currently coming off of boards in an ADP of end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th round. That is crazy to me considering he has averaged 189 fantasy points per game in each of the last 2 seasons. So within that average, if you go ahead and compare him to running backs last year, he would have been RB16. And in comparison to 2020, he would have been RB12. Again, this is a player that you're getting at the back end of the 5th or in the beginning of the 6th. And yet he still has value as a potential top 16 running back, like I mentioned before, who are all coming off the board by the end of the 3rd round. So go ahead and invest in running backs early. Take these wide receivers later because the value is certainly there. And not only is there value, I talked about upside. Every year, there's always that one wide receiver that has an incredible breakout season, minimum one. And then the next year, we're always trying to find that guy. So let's go back to 2019. That one wide receiver was Chris Godwin. He became the number 2 wide receiver in 2019. The year prior was number 25. Now, he wasn't the only wide receiver that had a huge breakout season. Kenny Golladay was there too. The season prior, he was the number 21 wide receiver, became the number 6 in 2019. So we saw 2 wide receivers go from being low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3s to becoming top 6 wide receivers in fantasy football. It's not the first time we've seen this happen. You go to 2019, 2020. We saw Calvin Ridley and DK Metcalf in 2019 be the number 25 and 32 wide receiver. The years following, Calvin Ridley, number 4 wide receiver, DK Metcalf in that same year in 2020, the number 7 overall wide receiver. Again, we continue to see wide receivers that are in that range between rounds 4 through 7 make giant jumps into that top 12 conversation. This last season, of course, we all remember Cooper Kupp went from being the number 27 wide receiver to number 1 in a given year. Deontay Johnson, 23 to number 9. And Jamar Chase, if you guys remember where he was being drafted, it's in that range. Rounds 3 through 7, maybe he was an 8th round pick, but maybe if you go ahead and invest into your running backs early enough, you won't have to address them later on and will have the opportunity of grabbing these players. Now, over the last 5 years, I've gone ahead and I've looked into it. When we're talking about running back 2s, so players that were ranked 13 through 24 in a given year, becoming RB1s, ranked 1 through 12 in the following season, we've only seen 8 running backs accomplish that in the last 5 years. In comparison to wide receiver position, where we've seen 15 wide receivers accomplish that. So 3 per year at the wide receiver position being able to accomplish that, which in comparison to the running back position almost doubles their number. So once again, to recap, we're not only just going after these early running backs because they have incredible opportunity and they are at times the most talented players on the board, but we're also trying to avoid those later running backs and invest in those later wide receivers because they're only going to set up success. But as you progress through a draft, after you've already gone ahead and selected your 2 running backs and maybe addressed the wide receiver in your 3rd round, the rest of your draft is pretty much determined by where the meta of fantasy football has begun to kind of turn into the direction of. And that, in my opinion, has been towards the tight end position. I've often said over the last couple of years that you should be drafting a higher end tight end. And I 100% am of the opinion that you should be doing so. Now, this can be accomplished whether it is, Travis Kelce, in your 1st or 2nd round pick, Mark Andrews in your 2nd/3rd round pick, or even Kyle Pitts at the back end of your 3rd round, beginning of the 4th. You can always address these early tight ends, which is going to give you a positional advantage. I went ahead and I demonstrated how big of a difference it is, and I'll go ahead and pop it on screen right now. So as you can see on screen, over the course of the last 5 years in terms of the tight end averages, the drop-off is unbelievable. So if you are not investing early at the tight end position, you might as well not touch it at all. And I'll explain to you exactly what I mean by that. Last season, we only saw 4 tight ends finish with over 150 half PPR fantasy points. There were more team defenses and twice as many kickers that were able to accomplish that fantasy point total. Again, that kind of gives you a little bit of context as to when you're playing in a league with 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, a kicker defense, 1 flex. If you're playing in a shortened league where you don't have the ability to add a super flex or an additional flex or a 3rd wide receiver, the value of those primary tight ends are going to be increased because they're contributing to the overall impact of your week that much more. So if in fact you're not grabbing a tight end early enough, the kickers and defenses of your team, quite frankly, are going to be more valuable to, your overall production. And quite frankly, those are random positions. I know some people are really good at ranking kickers and defenses. I find that they're relatively random to an extent because, who knows if your quarterback's going to get sacked on the 50-yard line and here comes a 60-yard field goal banging it and giving you points, right? These aren't things that we're anticipating, but we're hoping is going to happen. So if you're going to leave your league to luck, by all means, avoid an early tight end. But again, there has been safety in avoiding tight end and not going for those middle round guys. If you can go ahead and grab one early between rounds 1 through 6, you can grab the Kelce, Andrews, Pitts, Kittle, Schultz, Darren Waller combination, one of those guys within your first 6 rounds. After that, I'm out. Again, I said this on my tier list video yesterday. I want David Njoku. I want players way down the line because I'm looking for tight ends who are going to achieve a top 12 standing for the first time in their career and are going to come out of nowhere because those are the players that I want to invest in. I want, cheaper value tight ends that I can go ahead and have overall upside with. In the last 5 seasons, we have seen 23 such tight ends come out of nowhere and be tight end ones for the first time in their careers. You go back to 2017, it was Evan Ingram. 2018, it was Kittle and Hooper. 2019 was Waller and Andrews. 2020 was Tunyon and Logan Thomas. 2021, again, Pat Freiermuth, Dawson Knox, Dalton Schultz. 3 tight ends that came in and were immediate impacts. And I know Freiermuth didn't finish as a top 12 player, but in terms of averages, the back end of that year, week 6 through 18, with Big Ben Roethlisberger, he was incredible. He's averaging over 10 fantasy points per game. And these are all guys you were able to grab off the waivers. So again, unless you're investing early in that tight end position to give yourself a positional advantage, then just wait, purely. Again, for those of you who look at like what Kittle put up last season in terms of total fantasy points and think, Andrew, well, he really didn't have that much of a difference compared to my 150 point tight end I could have drafted in the 8th round. He purely did. Last season, George Kittle put up 159 fantasy points between weeks 1 through 17. Okay. He only played 13 games out of the eligible 16. So that means if you had drafted George Kittle last season, you not only got the 159 fantasy points that he provided, but when he was out with injury in those 2 games and out with a bye week in the other, you had another tight end in there that hopefully, if you had drafted correctly and had a player that maybe you picked up off waivers in that given week that produced well and was able to average 8 fantasy points in those 3 games where Kittle wasn't active for you, you add an additional 24 points onto the 159 that he provided, you're getting yourself a top tier tight end. I don't care that George Kittle misses time. You always are obligated to go ahead and draft a backup who's not only going to provide value for you in those weeks that they miss, whether it's bye or injury, but you're also going to have a player on your roster that may end up being a trade piece later on. That's why I'm always talking about drafting early tight ends, because though you may look at the fantasy point production of a tight end and think, well, Andrew, he didn't really have more, he only had 9 more points of eligible fantasy production for me from weeks 1 through 17, but you're not taking the full, story into the scope. You have to understand that you had other tight ends in your roster providing for you. And if in fact George Kittle is to play a full season, but then by all means, he's going to put up his 12.5 points per week and put you on the right path. Either way, the final thing I wanted to mention, besides addressing an early tight end, whether that is in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, is doing the same with the quarterback position. The quarterback position over the last couple years has just completely taken off in fantasy football. In 3 out of the last 4 seasons, in a standard 4-point per passing touchdown league, we have seen a quarterback surpass 400 total fantasy points. The only other time we've seen that was with Peyton Manning back in 2013. And the fact that Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen have been able to do that in 3 out of the last 4 years, that is insanity. On top of the fact that if you even go back to 2020, even though we didn't have a 400-point quarterback, Josh Allen was 5 points away. And, if you guys remember, in that final week against the Miami Dolphins, week 17, he only played the first half. Very easily, we could have had 4 consecutive years of a 400-point fantasy quarterback. And what I'm trying to get at here is that the quarterback position in fantasy football has evolved. We have begun to see that pocket passers are no longer as valuable as the current running quarterbacks that are absolutely taking over the National Football League. Now, whether that is running for 700 yards or running for just a mere 250 yards, I 100% believe that those rushing stats continue to elevate the position. And like we've seen in the last couple of years, that position is elevated to a level that we really have never seen before. In the last 2 seasons, we have seen back-to-back years of 11 quarterbacks surpassing 300 total fantasy points. You just go back to 2017, we only had 1 quarterback surpass 300 fantasy points. Again, the position has exploded, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have mobile quarterbacks that are just as good in terms of passing the ball. And the main reason for that is because at this current moment in time, we have mobile quarterbacks that are just as good as the pocket quarterbacks in the National Football League and will continue to get better and put up far more and more points as we progress year to year. Just looking at quarterbacks who have been able to rush for 250 plus yards in a given year. Since 2017, we have seen 59 quarterbacks accomplish that. Those quarterbacks, when they have ran for 250 yards in a season, they've also accompanied that performance with an average of 4.03 rushing touchdowns per year. Now, if you continue to elevate the number to 500 rushing yards, we're talking about 6.47 rushing touchdowns per season. You elevate that number to 700 rushing yards, we're talking about 7.00 rushing touchdowns per season. So not only are you getting that 25-point uptick with that 250-yard value, you're also getting an additional 24 fantasy points from the rushing touchdowns. You're getting a 49-point boost, which in comparison to a normal quarterback, that's an additional 12.25 passing touchdowns in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. For a pocket passer to compete with a player like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, in order for them to compete with that level of quarterback, they've had to do a lot over the last couple of years. Again, pocket passers over the last 2 seasons, for example, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford, guys that were able to achieve top 6 fantasy standings despite their lack of mobility, were able to do so only because they were able to throw for 40 or more touchdowns in their given years. Now, in terms of passing yardage, all of them were able to get over 4,100 passing yards, but the main, contributor to their success was passing in total touchdowns. If you're able to get over 40 total touchdowns, you're going to get into that conversation. And when we look at the quarterback position over the past decade and where it's been trending, we look at how many quarterbacks were able to total 40 touchdowns. There have been 21 that have done so. 8 of them were pure pocket passers, while 13 of them were mobile quarterbacks. When you're getting into a position where the mobile quarterbacks are that much more inclined to score fantasy points because of that rushing total, but are just as capable in terms of scoring total touchdowns, really the only difference maker is passing yards. And quite frankly, the separation between the two is becoming thinner every single year. So again, you want to address an early quarterback. So if you're on the pace of drafting a running back within your first 2 rounds, you grab a wide receiver in your 3rd, you look at the 4th round and think to yourself, well, maybe this is where I strike and grab my Patrick Mahomes. I grab my, Lamar Jackson. If not, no big deal. You could take another wide receiver there, tight end in the 5th, quarterback in the 6th. But the entire point is to leave that first 6 rounds with a balanced roster. Because when you play in a league where you start only 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, that is the pillar of your team. Like those are the main contributors. Every single week, your wins and losses will be determined by those 6 players. If they pan out correctly, they end up winning you the league, or they end up being the reasons why you can't win. And every subsequent pick after that, from round 7 through 18, however many rounds you have, they are, optional players. They're guys that are going to come in certain circumstances. There is a flex player that can be talked about. Again, you can find a flex player off the waiver wire every single year. You can find a flex player between round 7 through 12. But if you go ahead and have a solid quarterback, solid tight end, and the pillars at your running back and wide receiver positions are correctly approached and are at the highest potential value they can be at, then you're in a recipe for success. And that is why this is my favorite draft strategy going into the 2022 fantasy football season. It's the one that I try to use the most, and I'll continue to try to share with you guys in order for you to kind of get an idea as to why I'm approaching as such. Now, again, you can go about this in many which ways. You can start wide receiver, take 2 running backs, take a quarterback in the 4th, a tight end in the 5th, come back for a wide receiver in the 6th. Again, like I mentioned, you can find Brandon Cooks at an ADP of late 5th, early 6th round. There are going to be values there at wide receiver position between rounds 3 through 7. So you don't have to worry about taking another early one if you don't want to, and you're going to continue to prioritize an early tight end, like taking 2 running backs within your first 3 rounds, taking Kyle Pitts or Mark Andrews in the 3rd, a quarterback in your 4th, and completely at that point you have ignored wide receiver, but you can still find a lot of value in these smaller leagues in which, again, 2 starting wide receivers. If it's 12-team league, if it's a 10-team league, my goodness, you're in a position that you're going to still have 2 top 24 receiving options on your roster, while the rest of your team is going to give you that positional advantage every single week to guide you to victory. Either way, those are my opinions. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, be sure to subscribe if you want more content on the daily, helping you trying to win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship this upcoming season. Of course, if you haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy yet, be sure to go ahead, go down to the description of the video, click on the link, go to the website. If you use promo code Andrew today, when you make a first-time deposit, not only do you get a first-time deposit match of up to $100, you will also get my 2022 Fantasy Football Draft Rankings for a half full PPR scoring format, by tier, by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, along with my top 200 flex. Thank you, everybody. I'll be live streaming later today. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.